back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is The Magic of Words, the Legacy of Runes in Digital Games. So, before we actually get talking about how the runes are used in a couple of our case study games, I thought I might actually talk about runes and runestones first of all. Runes are tricky. This is probably the simplest way to put it. They don't just have to be translated, they also have to be transliterated. And there are different systems of runes. There's the Elder Futhark, the Younger Futhark, the latter of which is considerably more simplified. It is not simple to read runes. Scholars study their whole lives to be able to transliterate them and translate them. And even when they do, there's no real guarantee that they're doing it in any sort of wholly accurate way. Probably is the best way to put it. And that's a little frustrating because honestly, the runestones, so the surviving inscriptions that we have from medieval and pre-medieval Scandinavia, are some of our only sources from the actual Scandinavian viewpoint, especially those prior to Christianity. So it is worth, of course, persevering with runes and trying to understand them as best that we can. But it's always going to be an imperfect window to be looking through in an attempt to actually see what was going on the ground. Because what they're used for is quite limited. I mean, we cannot call the Scandinavians illiterate because obviously they have a form of writing, but it isn't a form of writing that's used for many things. And certainly, there would almost certainly have been runes used in more perishable forms. And of course, we would not have them. The climate is not necessarily conducive to the survival of anything but metal and stone. So I'd like to talk a little bit about runestones. We have quite a few examples of them, specifically from the 10th and 11th century in Scandinavia and also in England. About 3,000 of them in total. There are some from the 9th century, and there are a few from prior to that in what we call the Vendel period, the pre-medieval period of Scandinavia, but they're very difficult to interpret because the rune system is simply not as well developed at that point. What we see them being used for is generally to commemorate the dead. Not just the fact that they died, but also a little bit about what they did in their lives. Often if they did something particularly admirable, the runestone commemorates that. We often see them raised or placed around or even in churches. And this doesn't necessarily mean the people involved were Christian or not fully Christian. They were just the Scandinavian version of Christian, especially in the earlier period. But churches as being a central community hub, that may not even have been where the runestones started, some of them. They may have been moved into the churches afterwards. They are usually raised by family members, and oftentimes the inscription will state who raised them. It's specifically in Denmark that it becomes a very common practice amongst the upper classes. They often start with X raised this stone in memory of Y, and then we'll give further detail. There's a lot that these runestones can actually tell us about social relationships. Multiple runestones can be erected for the same person. So we know, for instance, that one man's 4 sons all raised a runestone for him after his death. This may have been an attempt to emphasize their dead father's importance, or perhaps just that they were good sons and being all filial about it. Sometimes when we have multiple runestones, it suggests there may have been a fight over the inheritance. Now, titles do not commonly appear in runestones. Only a small percentage of the corpus actually includes them. Usually in areas where it was more of an elite activity, we see more reference to titles. Sometimes there will be specific references to thanes or drengers. We don't really know exactly how to translate these titles. They were people who were in service to the Danish king in some sense. A significant number of runestones were raised by women, and this suggests that they had some form of wealth at their disposal. But 12% of them are actually sponsored by women on their own. So these women, widows perhaps, certainly had a great deal of social independence to be able to do this. But another 15% were sponsored by women together with men. And there were a number of stones that actually commemorated women as well. They were overrepresented amongst a particular type of stone, and that's a rune stone that's raised to commemorate the building of a bridge. So this is interesting. This tells us that building a bridge or a road is an act that's laudable enough to be commemorated by a runestone. And we've got to think about the geography of Scandinavia here. Lots of deep rivers and so forth to be passing over. A very hilly, mountainous area, so roads are difficult. So obviously any kind of contribution infrastructure-wise is going to be very welcome and worthy of remembrance via something permanent. And certainly in the Christian period, bridge or road building becomes even more of a laudable act, usually because it's done leading to pilgrimage sites. And that's important to the Christian church. Now, that was sort of the practical side of runes. We now have to look at the literary and the magical side of it. One of the readings that you were meant to do for this week was just a little chunk of the Havamal. Odin hangs on Yggdrasil. So this was just something that was added to your reading list. We're not going to talk about it in any great depth except at the Zoom session, but I would just encourage you to make sure that you read it, because one of the things it stresses in great detail is the importance of words, the magical power of words, and how much Odin sacrificing himself on Yggdrasil for all those days was about learning how to use runes, learning how to recognize them, learning how to cut them. The poem calls them characters of colossal power woven by the wisest one. Talks about their origins amongst the Aesir and the elves and the dwarfs and the giants. It's really interesting to see these connections between magic and poetry and prayer. There's a very strong implication that words are magical work. And I want you to think about what it means about Scandinavian culture that you have this connection. Why are words seen as potentially magical? And I would also remind you to make sure that you recall we have encountered this once already. We've seen runes being used in a magical context in the last lecture when we talked about scorn poles. So they can be used for both good and ill. It's magic, again, is not necessarily moral or immoral. It's about what the use is that you put it to. And I think that's a common theme in Scandinavian culture as well. All right, so let's talk about the games a little bit. We're actually only going to talk about two, because runes do not play a particularly significant role in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. They exist as part of equipment-related mechanics and also sometimes as decorative elements. There are a couple of mysteries that are ongoing that may be connected to upcoming DLCs where runes might play more of a role, but we don't know what they mean yet, so it's not really worth delving into them in much depth. Now, Skyrim, of course, has a very significant role for runes. The Nords basically borrow the dragon tongue, and they use these runes to serve not only as language for the grave markers, but also for magic. So one of the things you do, pardon me, as the Dragonborn, is you seek out word walls. And so these are inscriptions of parts of the Thu'um that you can learn, so the dragon shouts. You find them in scattered locations, usually tombs and the like. They're usually guarded. You have to go through quite the ordeal to get in there and get at them. They are not easy to learn by any stretch of the imagination. Once you're there, you pick them up pretty quickly because you are, part dragon. But about the easiest piece of a Thu'um you learn is when you actually go to High Hrothgar, and the Greybeards just basically give you a couple of pieces. But it's meant to be difficult. It's meant to be part of your growth as the hero, basically. it is a mechanical thing, but it is also really quite true to the way runes are depicted in Norse culture. It's always been one of the more authentic touches about Skyrim's use of Norse mythology and Norse culture. The focus on the power of words is very appropriate to me. Okay. So God of War sort of deepens this. It goes even further into the use of runes. You see them all over the place. They are part of the puzzle process. You see them in tattoos. You see them as decorative elements. There are runes everywhere in God of War. And in most cases, Atreus is the translator of these runes. Pardon me, I'm losing my voice. Because he learned them from his mother. And so he is the one who tells his father what the various inscriptions they encounter mean. Now, there has been a lot of attention paid to the way runes are portrayed in this game. And in most cases, they are represented as a simplified version of the Elder Futhark, so the older version of the runic alphabet. But, as I said, simplified. So there are, it's not quite as complex in the way it's spelled and the way the runes are shaped. And those fans who are well-versed in transliterating and translating runes have also said that when Atreus translates them, the translations tend to be more literary than literal. Which, to be perfectly honest, I'm fine with, because you can't always translate things literally. It just doesn't sound good. And, the fact that any of this is rooted in real runes is pretty impressive when it comes right down to it. So I'm fine if they cut corners and they make things a little bit simpler. Now, as I said, it's part of the puzzle mechanics. And the fact that they've made them accessible so even fans with the appropriate knowledge can work on translating them is interesting. But what fans have also done, and this is really cool, is they've started to transliterate and translate runes found elsewhere in the game. So runes found in random places, runes found in tattoos on various characters, runes found as background decorative elements, even down to the runes found on the back of the game's steel case. And there are messages in all of this. There are little bits and pieces of information about the characters. The inscription on the back of the steel case is basically a summary of how the father and son are going to go on a journey at the behest of the one who came before and learn all of this about themselves and their place in the world. And apparently there are still runic messages in God of War that people have not found. That was what I read the last time I looked into this. And I am intrigued, and I'm going to be fascinated to know if they do the same thing with Ragnarok, because I think that's brilliant. That is encouraging people to engage with the cultural background that they're using for the purposes of this game, and getting people to learn more about the history and so forth. It's just an amazing addition. They're not just having fun, they're also doing something educational. They're learning a little bit about the reality of Norse life. There's no better way to do that than to learn about their alphabet. And so it steers people away from this romanticized version of the Old Norse and towards something closer to concrete reality. Now, of course, you also see runes used in God of War as mechanics. They are added to weapons and armor. You have runic summons as part of combat, that sort of thing. I think that's inevitable. Runes are interesting visually speaking, and you can have many different types of runes, all of which can do different things. We see this in Valhalla as well. So it's a very simple adaptation to have them be part of gear mechanics. And I would be surprised if we ever saw a Viking game that did not do that. Anyhow, this is a bit of a shorter lecture. This is it for this week too. I've decided I'm not going to do the lecture on the Jotun just because there's not enough to really constitute a full lecture. I just wanted you to think a little bit more about runes and how the two games use it, and we're going to look in more depth at both actual examples of runestones and the sort of magical interpretation of runes that we see in things like the Havamal at our Zoom session. So I will look forward to seeing you then. Have a good night, all.